Hi there, everyone. I'm really excited to be able to share this great panel with you today. So, this panel brings together innovative leaders from the world of incident management, open telemetry, large scale distributed systems to discuss and share their current thoughts on the state of observability and understandability. So please actually make sure to leave your questions in the chat and I'll be able to ask our panelists those questions. And yeah, you'll just be hearing from our technical experts who've actually been in the trenches. They've achieved incredible results and they've learned a ton along the way. So I'm excited to have them here to share with you today. And the speakers on this panel didn't just do the work, they also created entire movements to bring thousands of people along with them to achieve and celebrate success in these areas too. So, really excited to do this today. All right, please turn your cameras and mics on, panelists. Great, we've got Ben joining us. Awesome. Hey, Ben.
Hi.
We've also got Jason and John. All right, here we go. Perfect. Fabulous. And thanks to everyone. If you came along to the talks this morning, we had awesome talks from John and Ben where they shared a lot of really great information. And also thanks for joining us in the speaker hangouts. Lots of great questions there too. We ran out of time. So we've got more time now. So if you have questions that you really wanted to ask and you didn't get a chance to, now's definitely the time. So feel free to just pop those in and I'll ask them as we go along. And I have a few questions that I wanted to get started with. But first, I just want to go around. If folks haven't attended your talks early in the day, also, Jason, if they haven't seen your talks from before either, maybe we can just do some quick intros. So Jason, would you like to start first?
Sure. Hey, everyone. I'm Jason Yee. I work at Gremlin as the Director of Advocacy, which means I get the amazing pleasure of working with Tammy on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, I've given talks on everything from monitoring and observability to chaos engineering to innovation, which is my passion, is how do we help engineers be better and create the next big thing or just improve their lives. So I do a lot of talks. Currently, I've been doing a bunch of videos on YouTube. So if you search for me on YouTube or just follow me on Twitter, I'll post links to that.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. So Ben, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thanks for having me. My name is Ben Sigelman. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO at Lightstep. I'm having a weird day because my house is under construction because of some foundation issue and there are jackhammers. So I decided to come into the office for the first time in over a year. So this is apparently what it used to be like to go to work, but it's good to be physically here and also good to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. John.
Hey, everyone. I'm John Egan. I'm a CEO and co-founder at Cantaba. We're an incident management platform to try and help companies be able to implement best practices for incident management across the entire organization, as opposed to just within their SRE teams. So excited to be here. I gave a talk earlier today about why it's important for companies to increase the overall number of incidents that they're tracking internally as a top-level metric, as compared to maybe some of the more standard MTT star metrics. And psyched to get more deep into your questions here.
Awesome. Fabulous. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here today. So the first question I wanted to start with, previously, like when I worked at Dropbox, I worked with a lot of folks who were from Google and YouTube, and then also a lot of folks who were from Facebook. And it was really interesting to hear their different viewpoints of how they did things. And Ben, like you came from Google, John, you came from Facebook. So I thought it would be interesting. Have you noticed that yourselves, that there's kind of like a different view from Google to Facebook of how to, for example, manage incidents? You both talked about SLOs and SLIs. I'd love to hear first from you, John. What are your thoughts there?
So having not worked at Google, I won't try to speak directly to how things operate there. I'll say, what I thought worked really well at Facebook was its ability to ingest the incident process across the entire organization, such that if you're an employee at Facebook and something's happening deep within the engineering team, deep within the infrastructure team, or otherwise, you always have immediate and open visibility into everything from the top level information on that incident all the way down to the specific details of exactly what's being done. And it was this really powerful impact of everyone in the company knew what a Sev1 was. Everyone knew how to respect that and sort of stay off people's backs when things are being worked on as high priority. And the cultural impact of that was really strong. It meant everyone from sales team out to PR team out to otherwise responded really well to the occurrence of these incidents. And as a product manager there, where I primarily operated, that was really impactful for me as a non-engineer, actually, in that the way that we responded to incidents started to look similar to the way that engineers and SREs and sort of or groups of people who have been doing this for much longer than us would approach things, and we would match that. And I thought it was a really powerful indicator across the company of sort of shared cultural values up from engineering. And a lot of the things that one of the reasons I sort of pushed back on things like MTTR and some of those areas is those top level cultural impacts. I thought long-term actually had a more visible long-term resilience effect on the organization versus just sort of like the deep, in metric or in incident response metrics themselves.
Yep. Taking the bigger picture. And Ben, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I never worked at Facebook, right? So I'm not going to speak for the Facebook side of it, but I would agree, Tammy, and I think we've spoken about this, privately, that there are some cultural differences, I guess, between the way that SRE was practiced in those two organizations. But for Google, it's funny. They did a lot of things right. Like, I think it was really cool and progressive of them to say, we're not going to call this ops. We're going to call this site reliability engineering, which I think they coined that term. I believe they did anyway. It seemed very new when I heard it. And think about this as a real practice. And it was, I think, really amazing that they did that. And it was so amazing that they created their own organization for site reliability engineering that was parallel to the product and engineering organization. I'm not sure that was such a good idea. I mean, it ended up creating, the org chart. When there's 10 people, it's fine. But when you have 1,000 people in an organization, it does inevitably become somewhat political. And there just wasn't that much political incentive to be reasonable. And I do remember a meeting I had once where I won't say who it was, but I was talking to a very senior leader in the SRE organization about Monarch, which was our distributed multi-tenant time series database, kind of like a metrics system. And we were trying to figure out what the SLA should be for Monarch. And I just asked him, what kind of availability requirement do you need? And he's like, I need 100% availability. And I was like, that's not reasonable. So can you tell me how many nines? Can you just, or something, something not 100. He's like, no, I need 100% reliability. And it wasn't reasonable, but he had no reason to be reasonable politically. And I think having SRE as a completely segregated organization allowed him to be completely unreasonable, and he was. And as a result, you can go look at the Monarch paper. It's awfully reliable, I will say. It also consumes steady state, 250,000 VMs are dedicated to Monarch. Just think about how expensive that is, it is extremely expensive. And that was not, in my mind, actually the right decision. We probably should have, instead of shooting for 4 nines, should have shot for 3 nines and then had some other thing for the super, super high availability or whatever. But it's just the political situation was it wasn't his P&L and he didn't care. So he just asked for an unreasonable amount of reliability. And here we are. So I think that there is some kind of, there's a lesson there. SRE is an amazing thing, but I think there needs to be a check and a balance on reliability as a goal. It needs to be balanced with other product velocity concerns and cost. And I don't think that Google set things up to succeed in that regard. Not to say that everyone was political, of course, but it was an issue.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting conversation. This came up also in your talk, Ben, earlier about cost, just the costs associated with observability, being able to understand systems and what's happening. And, Amazon's famous for everyone saying that they're very frugal, right? They're trying to always reduce costs and keep costs down. It's kind of one of their cultural items that they really do focus on. So it's just interesting. Different companies do things different ways and have different goals that they strive towards. And I think that's great, to be able to learn from how people do things. Something else that I'm really interested in is, how have hobbies outside of work helped you observe and understand systems? So Jason, I'd love to start with you. I always think this is really interesting because, our job day to day isn't the only thing that we learn from. What else do you learn from?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I love about being an engineer. Whoa, sorry. a crow just flew into my window. And now I have feathers stuck to my window. This is great things that you don't get in back when we were in offices. Random things happening. Sorry.
See what you're missing out on, Ben?
Extra
Yeah,
chaos.
did you? But you observed the crow, right? You observed it.
I
so
did.
That's
I
a
observed the crow.
perfect answer to the question.
I think the question was about learning, right? And
Yeah, how have
I
your
guess-
hobbies helped you learn? Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big reason why there's such a movement for like this idea of bringing your whole self to work, right? Is like we learn from all these other things that we do. So as an example, right, what we deal with, we always talk about complex systems and, you know, blah, 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 like you can't look for single root causes because we're in a complex system, and everybody has this idea of like this implicit understanding. Yeah, it's a complex system, but then oftentimes we treat it like it's not, right? So one of my pandemic hobbies that I picked up was chocolate making, like bean to bar chocolate making. I buy raw cacao beans from an importer who goes around the world getting cacao, and I roast it in my oven and I like shell it and then like make chocolate. And it is simultaneously like one of the most fun, enjoyable things that I've done and learned how to do, and also extremely frustrating because when you make chocolate, there's a process of tempering, right? And the idea is that chocolate that you buy in the store, it doesn't melt in your hands because it's tempered, right? It has this nice snap when you break it. And that's a process of crystallization. And it's this extremely complex thing of like the smallest changes in humidity in your room. You can do almost everything the exact same and have something that completely fails. Whereas you did it yesterday, and because that humidity was slightly off, like it came out perfect. And I think that's something that I've started to realize as we deal with the systems we work on is we inherently understand that it's complex, but I don't think we realize how complex when we're talking about like, I automate deployments and we did, 24 deployments yesterday. And the idea of what worked in the morning may not work, an hour from now because you just had like 10 different deployments going on. So I love bringing in that stuff because I think it helps us make better sense when we're thinking about the stuff we work on.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it helps explain it to folks as well that don't work in our world. If they ask you like, how come things just don't work perfectly every single day? They worked great yesterday. Like you can really take those different ideas and share that with people to explain it. I love that as well. So what about you, Ben?
I was too interested in what Jason was saying to prepare a response.
He's very good at making chocolate. I've eaten it. It's great.
Is that right? That sounds interesting. I'm with you on the crows. I posted it in chat, but I'm not exaggerating. My wife and I were just talking this morning. A crow woke up our entire family and was like banging on our roof, and they've just been totally wild. I think that there's not enough scraps of food on the ground, and they're all really hungry this year or something like that. Anyway, to get to your actual question. Honestly, the only thing that's really coming to mind, but it is coming to mind, is parenting. I think that this has been like ultra intense parenting year, and it is sort of like a learning thing. Like, how do you help your kids learn and experience the world when their world is so much narrower than it usually is? And I think, we've tried to do what we can. And it was interesting that we, finally things started opening up, and we took my 3-year-old to an aquarium basically. And we thought this could be so amazing. Like he used to love the aquarium, in the before times or whatever, had his mask on and everything. And he was initially excited to get there, but then after like 20 minutes, like, I want to go home. Like, I want to go home. It was like too much learning, like too fast or something, like too much stimulus. It was very interesting. So I've been thinking a lot about just, in terms of learning, like about just the amount of stimulation and the type of stimulation that we receive, and how if you suddenly make some giant change on that front, I think it can be very overwhelming for people. I don't know if that makes any sense. It's certainly not related to observability, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot this year as everyone's just been so narrowed in, on whatever it is that we do. It's much more focused than normal.
Yeah, I think it definitely makes sense in the world of understandability as well, right? Because sometimes just being overloaded with stimulation can be really confusing. So it's nice to have a simple way to be able to understand things. Yeah, especially when you are working in very complicated, like distributed environments, not only systems, but also people. It becomes very hard. How about you, John?
I think work just permeates everything that I do these days. So in some way or another, I feel like I look at the entire world through the lens of incident response and incident management. And the big thing that usually comes out for me around that is immediate prioritization of things in ways that my wife and my son definitely don't like, where we're interacting with an issue and they're dealing with like, well, is this really a Sev 1? I mean, let's be careful here. This like we don't really when I have a 3-year-old, so similar in the parenting world, when we're trying to deal with something, we're trying to go out the door and we really don't want to put our mask on or we really don't want to put our shoes on. And there's just screaming that you could hear down the street and around the corner. And it's like, oh, well, let's take a moment and let's look at the data and let's figure out whether the impact here is actually justifying sort of the degree of response that we're putting into it. And it's really funny because I think, I think 5 or 10 years ago, a lot of people who were really big junkies into the task management space had a very similar approach to the world where it was like, okay, we can apply, task management is really just to-do lists, right? And to-do lists work everywhere. And so I'm using, Asana at home to run my family. And I think a lot of people tried to kind of go out and do that for a little while. And I think like I've ended up doing the same thing with incident management, where it's like mentally in my head, I have this little incident graph and I want to put something up on the refrigerator that's like, okay, how many Sev 1s did we have last week? Let's talk about them. Are we going to write anything up? Are we going to work on it? But the reason I think it permeates similar to the task management space is there's some truth to it. You can apply a lot of the sort of blameless approaches to dealing with major incidents, in the workplace, or that we've absorbed, into products and best practices for things like incident management. You really can absorb those into your day-to-day life, and you really realize how aggressively human nature fights against a lot of our learnings. We really don't want to be blameless in our day-to-day lives. It's very difficult to sort of step back and say, these things probably went wrong, whatever they are, not having our shoes on, for going outside, all the way out to something bigger, like, forgetting to pay a bill or something like that. The very natural and easy reaction is always to just say, well, that's your fault, or that's my fault, or that's this person's fault. And I think the big learning that I've taken away from a lot of this and working in this space more directly over the last couple of years has really been this idea of look for the systemic cause. And if you address that systemic cause, you don't alleviate yourself of accountability. You're still accountable towards the thing that happened, but you're actually fixing the thing that caused you to act in that way. And very much just like I think Sidney Dekker in one of his books says, most people don't come to work to do a bad job every day. And if you sort of go into every conversation about incidents with that in mind, you'll come out stronger. I think it's very much the same in personal life, parenting. I think it's the same in cycling. I think it's the same in all of these different hobbies and things that I do. Is people aren't in this room or doing what they're doing, because they want to do a bad job. Everyone's here to try and do well and have a good time and live well. And that's sort of the way it's sort of permeated inwards and kind of helps me stay cognizant of focusing on that aspect of day-to-day life and hobbies.
Yes. Yeah, I love that. And Ben, you dropped out for a sec, but we've got you back. So that's awesome.
Yeah, that was just video. My laptop was not plugged in and I decided to mute while I fixed that.
Oh, okay, great. Back. So yeah, that made me laugh a lot, John. So many funny stories there. It makes me think about my own life as well. So my husband, he's a game designer. So, me coming from like being on call for many, many years, focusing on like looking after, distributed systems, making sure they're up and running. And he's more about making sure that things are fun and like enjoyable and really, really like just awesome experience. That's what he does. And he's been doing that for such a long time as well. And so for me, it's funny because I'll focus on like what we need to prioritize and like what we need to get done. And then he'll balance it out and make sure that even if it is like super high priority, we need to get it done within the next hour. It's still fun and enjoyable. So I think that's kind of cool how you can like balance the two things together. And we do have a question in the chat about games as well a little bit. And so in the board game space, this is from Chris. There is an ongoing debate about balancing the setting of a game and the systems or mechanics implemented. Often game systems set in a colonial period bring up conversations about conflicts between the observations of a system of mechanics and the themes abstracted from the system setting. So Chris's question is, Are there problematic themes, assumptions birthed from the abstractions built with modern day tooling for services? So would anyone like to take this first, this question?
I think it's an interesting question. I don't know that I would say that there are necessarily problems, but I think that the way we think about breaking things into services largely affects what we build. You can think of like Fred Brooks and like his whole concept that the way we, that the systems that we build mirror the organizations that build them, right? So if you decide that you've got a giant organization and you're going to break it into different teams, those teams suddenly become your services. And the way that those services connect are the ways they're mirrors of the way that your teams connect. And that can be problematic. I think the problems come when we presuppose that we're going to be in a certain framework and that things have to be a certain way. And I think, from my own experience, this often replicates in the fact that we have like the database team, right? Like your team doesn't own the data. They always have to go talk to that database team because we've naturally set it up that, well, there's a team that manages the database and they're the keepers of all the data. And so naturally, then you start to have this abstraction of like, well, then I don't control the data that my service needs. So now I have to think of an abstraction layer of how do I talk with that database team. So I think that, yes, the way that we set things up naturally impacts the way we think about things, and it can create some friction.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't mind jumping in, I mean, Chris, I know you were in the talk that I just did, but this is in some ways exactly what I'm getting at with this idea of resources versus transactions. Like we want to be able to talk about the health of individual transactions. That's sort of the point, right? Like that's what our customers care about. And you can almost see these movements occurring in our technology ecosystem where we're trying to make the resources align better to the transactions. In some ways, that's what things like Kubernetes are all about. Like the idea of a service, it can get more and more abstract until you're talking about serverless when it's literally just like a function call that we're abstracting. The trouble is that you can't get away from the fact that at the end of the day, there are physical resources being consumed, and those crop up in reality. It turns out that serverless is a wonderful abstraction, but the cost of making a network call is still way, 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 way higher, probably 1,000 to 1,000,000 times higher, depending on what kind of network you're on, than accessing something on like local disk or something like that, right? So you run up against the reality that if you try to make the sort of schema that you're using to understand an abstractor system, as you try to make that as sort of friendly as possible, you drift further and further from the physical reality of your resources. And those unfortunately dictate the performance and the cost profile of your system. And I think, this push and pull has been happening for decades and will continue for decades. But that's it's a great way to think about the talk I was giving around resources and how they relate to transactions in the first place.
Great. Thanks for sharing. And John, what's your thoughts there too?
I think a lot of the abstractions we see today, right? When we build abstractions out, we're really trying to compartmentalize complexity, right? We've got like complex systems, then we build another system above it that's simpler that then houses that complex system, and then another system above that that houses that complex system. And there's what's it called? The law of stretched systems, right? Which was like Rasmussen back in the 80s was talking about this, where every time you do that, you're just going to stretch the new system, right? Until it breaks. And then you're going to build another abstraction. You're going to stretch that system until it breaks, and you're going to keep building up. And I've always found that the biggest risk around those abstractions is you stop working to optimize the system that you abstracted in many cases, because now you're going to have to start focusing on the breaking points of the new system you've built on top of it. And I think this translates really cleanly to tools. And otherwise, in my field, in incident management, it really translates directly to kind of the increase in this butterfly effect of, one small thing done now propagates across these abstractions and down, and actually increases an order of magnitude each time that it works its way down. There's the, I think it was in the 50s or so when this was some of this was being researched, right? It was the difference between the mistake of pushing a wrong key on a typewriter and pushing a wrong key on a computer. right? Your impact of a mistake at that typewriter key is very limited and very small because you're in that base system. But now that you're abstracted so many levels of software and tooling and otherwise all the way up in the computer world, and you've clicked a key, you might have accidentally just brought down an entire data center, or otherwise. I was saying the other day we need child locks on keyboards now that everyone's working at home because the risk is so high. And so I think there's a huge risk there as we do tooling and as we continue to abstract out, where the difference between building software today and trying to understand it is now equally as complex as the infrastructure that we've gone out and built up. And maybe that's one of the reasons observability is such a big deal now. But I just think it's fascinating that that problem is just kind of going to continue to propagate. I don't think there's an end to it.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about. So there's one other question I wanted to ask all of you related to observability skills. How do you think that we should interview for observability skills? What are your thoughts there? Ben, I'd love to start with you.
You should always start with someone else. It makes it easier for me. I mean, as a practitioner, you mean, so interviewing someone who would lead like an observability team or something like that? Is that the idea?
Yep.
It's a great question, and one I hadn't exactly pondered. Of course, we interview people all the time at Lightstep, and that's a type of observability interview, but not the same type of observability interview. But I think what I'd really want to see, if I am thinking on my feet here, would be a focus on the outcomes of observability and the ability to articulate how those connect to the practice of it. I would say that it's been somewhat frustrating for me to see how fixated the industry is on, I have, in my head, there's some kind of hierarchy of observability. At the very, very bottom layer, you have like code instrumentation. And then above that, you have telemetry egress, and then telemetry storage, and then kind of data integration, and then maybe like UI UX, and then above that, like automation. And the conversation is like way, way, way at the bottom of that stack right now. And this is not valuable. I mean, observability is only valuable if it accelerates your velocity or improves your time, with an SLO. Like those are the only things that matter. So if you can't actually describe like how all that stuff at the bottom like actually affects the stuff at the top, I'm not that excited. So I think of course, there's no one true path. There's a lot of open questions and so on, but I'd want to see someone be able to navigate that, not just to talk about the goals, like, yes, we want faster velocity, but how do you do that with observability, and to describe it in practical terms and going all the way up and down that stack. That's what I would really be looking for. And I think you have people who kind of talk in hyperbole about the top of the stack and people who get like lost in the weeds at the bottom of the stack, but it's rare to find someone who can actually connect those dots in a really clear and coherent way.
Yeah, those are some great tips for folks who might be doing interviews around observability in the future. Like, it makes me think just pulling up if you're able to draw a diagram as well of that pyramid and talk through each of the items as you're doing your interview, it's like a really great way to explain to the person that you're interviewing with your thoughts and your frameworks that you use. So I love that idea. John, I'd love to ask you the same question, but about understandability in regards to incident management in general. Like, what would you interview for there? What are you looking for?
So I think when we're talking to people about understandability with respect to the space, we're really thinking a lot about translating active and emotional cases into practical systemic solutions, and it's a little bit of a of a EQ, right, when you're interviewing around that space, because it's an ability to walk that line between overly technical root cause analysis, right, that results in potentially the system level task changes that need to go into the organization to maintain state, to improve state, versus the sort of cultural and process changes that need to be implemented. Like the airline industry has gotten really wonderful at this, right, over the years, in terms of how do you train people into incident management regarding the response, but more importantly, sort of the then learnings and understandability on the other end of it, in such a way that the learnings and reasonings propagate out into the industry and the organization in a practical manner. It's the best way I can describe it. You're really looking for an ability there to translate things into consumable and actionable results, not just to go and write novels like at the outcomes. And so I think we look really closely at that when we talk to people about how to hire into this space, really, sort of when you're looking for incident commanders, or IMOCs that we had at Facebook. There's an interesting difference there, Facebook, Google, that I think you can dig really deeply into and have pretty deep conversations with folks. But if you don't have both, you won't actually solve the long-term resiliency challenges that you're trying to work through.
Yes. Yeah, that's awesome. I know a lot of folks have probably in the audience written up postmortems, and it's often, the next big step is like, what are we going to change after this incident happened? And we've written up this postmortem, like, what are our action items? How are we going to make sure those get done? Like, what did we actually do? And then afterwards, like, did they actually help us improve? So it's really like much more of a nicer circle instead of just ending it at the postmortem. So that's a great thing for folks to think about. I'm going to circle back as well to talk more about IMOCs and that incident manager role. I think that's a really interesting conversation for us to have as well. I just want to touch on one other question for Jason. So Jason, you have a lot of experience in chaos engineering. And so what would you interview for when you're looking for someone who understands how to observe and understand failure?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's a little combo of both what Ben said and what John said. Ben's idea, right, that like when it comes to observability, like previously when I was working at Datadog and things, like observability in and of itself isn't the end goal. And I think one of the challenges when I'm looking for people to hire is that understanding of like having a clear idea of how you fit into the system, right? What's the ultimate end goal? What's your contribution to it? Because if you can't define that, then you have no direction in what you're doing, right? And so having that overall understanding means that I can trust you, given whatever incident happens, that you'll know what to prioritize and you'll know how to act on that. So I think that's a big thing. Even when it comes to chaos engineering, right? So overall, like understanding what, we talk about reliability, but it's a pretty big blanket. And so what do we make reliable? How do we focus in on the things we need to be improving? Especially with chaos engineering, because it's this fun thing, but you can go around breaking anything and having no impact on the system and improving nothing, but you'll have a lot of fun doing it, right? So it comes down to that, like, where do I fit in the system? How do we look at a system and get the most benefit from what we're doing? And so the rest of it, the chaos engineering and the tools, like that's pretty straightforward.
Yep, love that. It actually makes me think of a saying that I think is from Facebook. Maybe, John, you can tell me, but I used to always hear focus on impact. Is that a Facebook saying? Yeah.
That was definitely a red letter poster, one of the big ones on the walls. Yep.
Yeah, so I used to always hear that at Dropbox when we were talking about incidents, postmortems, like doing chaos engineering. It was always like focus on impact, like make sure that what you're doing is positively impactful in a good way. It's going to actually help move the needle. We always would say that. So I really like that idea. And so now let's circle back to the idea of an incident manager on call, an IMOC. That's what we called it at Dropbox. I know at Amazon, they also call it a call leader. And so I didn't actually know that IMOC originally comes from Facebook. What's it called at Google, Ben? Is it the same or is it different?
Sorry, unmuting. I have to say, Google, despite having many SREs, there were different terms and terms and use of different teams. And I also left the company in 2012. The term incident commander I've definitely heard in my time at Google, but I'm not sure if it's something that was totally standardized. Like the search SRE team behaved and operated in a totally different way than the Gmail SRE team. And I can go into the whys of that. I think it was all like for good reasons, but I don't know if there really was I don't think that was as standardized as it was at Facebook in my experience anyway.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Would you like to tell us, John, about that? What's it like at Facebook having an IMOC?
Right. So just to set some context for folks listening, there's a couple of different terms for what arguably could be called the leader. during an incident, but has different terms as it's happening. And one of the more popular ones I think you see on a lot of organization sites are the incident commander, which Google had in their book in 2016 on SRE defined pretty directly. So Ben, I'm not sure if that evolved over time or if maybe that's just the public version that they wanted to put out. At Facebook, we practiced a slightly different role that was called the IMOC, which was the incident manager on call, and who we internally sort of joked was the responsible adult in the room. And the core difference between those roles, at least as I saw it, was that the incident commander role was a very hierarchical and almost militaristic type role. If you go look, at the definitions, and these vary on every company's site, but for example, PagerDuty has a set of definitions of how like an incident commander should run, and they're very aggressive, right? It's very much incident commander, ask engineer responder 1, is problem solved? If engineer responder 1 does not respond with a yes or no, remove engineer number 1 from call, insert engineer number 2, right? It's a very, very aggressive, approach to I think dealing with the micromanagement almost of an incident. The IMOC, I always felt, lended itself a little bit better to sort of multiple leadership roles, where you had an IMOC who was very well trained in incident management processes and can help to make sure things like leveling of the SEV are correct, can help to reach into the organization and across the organization, to folks who maybe aren't contactable. And the advantage of that is it permits the incident itself to also have a separate role that you might call the owner. And that owner doesn't necessarily have to be someone who's perfectly trained. It's simply the person who's currently responsible for the incident as it's being resolved. And it's a little bit more of a team effort. In an ideal world, the IMOC might do nothing other than just be present and aware of the incident happening while the owner is actually going out and doing the work. In a more complex world, the IMOC might be coming in and helping reach across the org if it's a PR impacting issue, or if it's maybe dealing with a cross team and it's a new engineer who's being the owner. And I think, I've actually found running Cantaba that the incident commander role is far more adopted, I think, across organizations today. If you were to go and take the entirety of organizations, I think in the Valley, and compare what they call that role, I think incident commander's taken root much more aggressively. And I sort of wish it would start to swing the other way, because I find the roles to be more about distributing accountability across the company to the various owners versus just saying, okay, everything comes back onto the incident commander's shoulders. And not to phrase that as if that's what happens at Google. That's what I see it having sort of translated into in a lot of other parts of the industry.
Yep. Awesome. Thanks, John, for sharing. Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. I've definitely seen lots of companies taking up this role. I myself was a IMOC at Dropbox for a long time as well. And yeah, you're responsible for every single system. You have to know about everything. It's a pretty big job. And also it's a 24/7 rotation, which is interesting too. So I just have one last question. We only have a few minutes left. I wish we had way more time because it's very interesting to hear all of your thoughts and your experiences from the past. And we do have a few questions in the chat as well. So I'm just going to quickly actually ask one question from the chat. So Ben, what is your thoughts on a fair retention time for tracing? Do you have a quick answer there?
Quick, no.
Difficult.
The question itself said that the value of tracing data falls over time, since they're less useful for identifying problems or possible improvements. I mean, I guess, it is true. I really want tracing sampling, which is what we're talking about here, to be based more on less on properties of the request itself, which is how things are done right now, and more based on hypotheses that are being examined or other things that are of interest, like an SLO, for instance. If a trace passes through an SLO, we need to be able to hydrate that SLO with enough trace and data to be able to do real comparisons between an incident that's affecting the SLO and a time when there's a baseline time when things are healthy. So even in healthy times, having a really a large volume of tracing data is quite useful for those sorts of comparisons. But I want the sampling to be based on things like SLOs or CI/CD. Like, if you do a new release, you want to up this trace sampling rate. So it's not just about time, it's about whether or not those traces are involved in some kind of change, planned or unplanned, that's of interest. So it's not the most satisfying answer, but I can't answer it it quickly. I'm sorry. I'm
That's all right.
incapable
It's all
of a
good.
concise answer.
All of these questions are great. They're very detailed. So thank you everyone for asking
excellent
awesome
question.
questions. Yeah. So my last question for today, just in a minute left, what's something that you wish everyone did at all companies? I'm going to share mine is like, I actually wish every company paid people extra for on-call over the holidays if they work that shift. Like if you work New Year's Eve, you should get paid extra for doing that on-call shift. So that's just mine. Anyone else want to share yours? If you could dream up anything.
I mean, I'll be selfish in the incident space. I think companies should directly reward people who file the most incidents. I don't care if it's gamed. I still think it should be done.
I think that's great. Reward and recognition is important. So, yep. How about you?
I'd say that.
Yep.
Yeah, I'd say that companies should spend more time and give employees time to actually explore. Right. I think we think of chaos engineering largely as reliability, but I like to think of it as just exploring and learning. And I think that that's something that engineers need more of.
Love it.
Yeah, and I think I would say that we have one of our values internally is being a multiplier, and it's a difficult thing to reward people for, but it can be measured in certain ways. Like I think if a service is written well and thoughtfully, and SLOs are determined well and thoughtfully, the service will contribute like a lesser portion to like the ultimate amount of user visible outages, and you're kind of being a multiplier for the product and for the rest of the organization. And I would love to see people rewarded for doing more than their fair share and like overall reliability of the system, because it's a hard thing to notice when it's happening, and it's very important, I think, overall.
Love that. That's awesome. I guess we all have the same idea around reward and recognition in general. So thank you so much for joining everybody here for this panel today. To John, Ben, Jason, thank you so much for all of your great answers, and to everyone that came along to attend the panel. Thank you so much. I hope you have an amazing QCon Plus.